Brutal.
All right, welcome to the RoastID competition hosted by Cropster and Balzic Brothers and Company. This is round two, and today we have our guest who we'll announce shortly, but you can probably see him on your screen. We had a really good turnout last week, and I think that I'm doing that slide, but you might have noticed that I'm not Taylor Wallace. Taylor Wallace is out sick today. So I'm covering for him. So I'll be functioning more as like a moderator. So as the presentation goes on, please drop your questions into the Zoom group chat, and then I'll be bringing those up into it. So as you join, please make sure your mics are off. Video can stay on. It's good to see your faces. But if you add in your questions, I'll try to bring them in at the right time, and we'll also have a Q&A at the end.
Yep.
But yeah, let's get started.
Perfect.
Cool.
So if you first want to talk about.
Yeah, that sounds good. So this competition, last week we realized that we didn't introduce ourselves. So this week we're going to go through that. So I work at Cropster. My name is Devin Connolly. I've been here for the last 6 years. But Cropster was founded back in 2007, and it's based in Innsbruck, Austria. And then we also have satellite offices. One of our main offices in Sacramento, California. We also have one in Hong Kong, Sao Paulo, and we also have partners all around the world. So our software is designed for the specialty coffee supply chain. What you might know it most for is Roasting Intelligence, our roasting application, but we also go into like an online database platform where it integrates all of the information that you have from coffee origin soon through to the cafe. But yeah, we're so happy that you're here.
Yeah. And then my name is Eric Stanek. I am a specialty sales associate for Balzic Brothers. And we are a specialty green coffee importer based out of Charleston, South Carolina, but we work all across the country. We were originally founded in 1917, so we've been around for just a bit. We're an independently owned company. And really our focus is bringing in sustainably sourced and high quality coffees and really being service oriented. So just doing what we can to do whatever we can for the roasters like all y'all watching right now. Yeah, so the first thing, as Devin had mentioned, is we're kind of just jumping into a round one recap, which is really exciting for both Cropster and Balzic Brothers to see just how many people competed in the first round. We were blown away. So we had 214 total responses in the first round. And then kind of on the left here, you'll see the breakdown of how people did. 24 people got all 5 of the curves correct in the first round. Mathematically, not possible to get 4 correct. So nobody got 4 correct. And then 76, 52, 55, and 7. Which means that if you, in the first round, were thinking, oh, I only got 3 or 2 right, like I'm out of the running to like win this all. Not at all the chance. Not at all the case. You still have a chance because there weren't a large number of people who got all 5 right. So yeah, just keep putting in your answers, and hopefully you did good this round. And then Devin, if you kind of want to pinpoint the locations of the competitors, which is super cool.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't think it's a huge surprise that the marketing campaign was done through the United States, but we have USA coming in at the top with 80, but we also have, Eric, I'm not great at counting. How many countries did we have participate?
Oh, shoot. I should have counted that beforehand. I don't even know.
I'll give you some time to do that.
Stop to everybody. Whoever's the fastest counter can count those. Let's say a lot.
35 says Felipe, and I'm going to trust him on it. So,
we're going to trust Felipe on this.
But we had participants from all around the world. I was really impressed that we had people from Iran and Saudi Arabia, and people in Europe where it was late in the evening for them, or Australia where it was in the middle of the night if they came to the webinar. So it's really just exciting to see people showing up, both for the competition but also for the webinar. We have 143 people on here right now, which is like 70% of the people who participated last week. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And so kind of just getting started, we'll chat first about the round 2 topics, especially in light of the first round. And so last week's curves and the theme in general was really to focus on kind of quote unquote defects or major things that you can do during the roasting process that will really degrade or influence quality significantly. And that kind of shifted this week, where we wanted to focus more on what it would actually look like when you were kind of dialing in a roast, where you're roasting so that you're trying to get it a little better or make minor changes, but you're not drastically changing anything. There's small differences, small tweaks that will change the quality, but not ruin the roast, which, as some of you might have seen, maybe makes it a little tougher because those changes on the cupping form are not as noticeable or not as big. And so, yeah, the topics that we're kind of going to dive into today are just the time of the roast matters, the end temperature and color, kind of relationships between time and temperature, and then really dig into all of the 3 roasting stages. And so the coffee, or the theoretical coffee that we were using for these curves this week, was a Kenyan coffee, a Kenyan AA from Kiambu County. It's a coffee that we bring in at Balzac Brothers that we're familiar with. And so it was kind of one that we kind of know how it kind of reacts and changes as you roast. And so, Devin, if you would like to introduce our wonderful guest this week.
Yeah, so I get the honor of introducing one of my good friends, Mr. Rob. So you can know him from a few different places. You might have met him at Roasters Guild. You might have met him through his book. He's an overall helpful guy with a really, really good string for bad jokes, which hopefully we will get a chance to see today. He's director of coffee at Nosa Familia, and also the author of the great book, Modulating the Flavor Profile of Coffee. He also does some amazing online courses. I've heard great things about his Akawa course that he's recently been doing. But he's globally renowned. So let's welcome Rob.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. And unfortunately, Devin means that my jokes are just not funny. Not that they're necessarily risque or something like that. They're just purely not funny. So we'll definitely get some of those out, I'm sure.
My favorite thing is that you'll make a joke in your because I've traveled with you. You'll make a joke in your presentation and it'll fall completely flat. And then you'll say, "Oh, won't make that joke again." And then the next day you'll make the same
Every day's a new day. Every day's a new day.
And then go, "Oh, won't make that one in the presentation." So it warms my heart. I think you're a great guy. I'm really looking forward to your knowledge that you're going to share with us today.
Right on. I'm excited.
And so kind of before we dive into the round 2 answers, we just kind of wanted to clarify some of the verbiage or the wording we're going to use during as we talk about the curves. And so specifically the roasting stages or roasting phases. And so Rob, if you could talk about these just a little bit and what each one of them actually is to you and how you define them, so that when you're describing them, the audience kind of has an understanding of what you're talking about.
Yeah, totally. So these stages are ones that I've discussed with people for a long time now, and I'm going to add a couple more verbiage-wise that aren't necessarily on the slide. But we'll start with ones that are. So drying is the phase before color change happens. So from the very beginning of the roast on. That doesn't mean that all of the drying happens during this phase. In fact, the coffee is drying out the entire time with a rather large amount of the moisture being released at first crack. But during this stage, drying is the thing that is happening where there's not really a lot of chemical reactions that are starting. So that's kind of what we're referring to when we talk about drying, is everything from the beginning of the roast up into yellowing point. Now, chemical reactions do have to start in order to create yellowing. So technically, the Maillard reaction starts a little bit earlier than yellow point. But it's really difficult to call something you can't see. And since all of us have different thermocouples, which give us different temperature readouts, there's no way to just like pick a temperature and say this is it. So we go with the first visual indicator that something has happened. So from yellowing point then on until first crack, the predominant chemical reaction that's happening is the Maillard reaction. It has a lower activation temperature than caramelization does, caramelization of sucrose specifically. And so we have basically a non-enzymatic sugar browning process starting from yellowing and running probably throughout the entirety of the roast. It does depend on the coffee and how many proteins, amino acids, and reducing sugars are available. But there's a likelihood that it actually continues throughout the entirety of the rest of the roast. First crack then is kind of the next wall where we notice something major is happening or something different. And, first crack is something that roasters have been noting for ages, right? So because it's like, oh, suddenly it sounds like popcorn, something different's happening. Maybe we should pay attention to that. But basically, at and around first crack, there's a significant amount of water vapor content that comes out of the coffee seed and allows the heat to start penetrating the seed and causing chemical reactions in a way it wasn't able to before when all that water was present. And so when we refer to development time, we're really talking about that very crucial time where the water is leaving the core of the seed and the chemical reactions are beginning to happen in the core of the seed in earnest. And so that becomes our discussion of development time. And right now, development time is kind of looped into just one general category. It's not first crack until the beginning of second or first crack until first crack stops. Right now, it's just kind of talked about as the same category where there is a secondary building of pressure around second crack that we're not really accounting for. So,
sure.
Yeah,
that's wonderful.
Other terms that I'm going to throw at you real quick. Turning point, sometimes called tap. Turnaround point is going to be the point at which the bean temperature curve drops or bottoms out. You can see it there as the first dot. Oh, there you go. Oh yeah, we have markup on Zoom. I totally forgot about that. So that's turnaround point. Turnaround point is not going to be, it's important, but it's not important in the way that a lot of people assign importance to it. Okay, so turning point is going to be very machine dependent. It's going to be dependent on the thermocouple thickness and placement specifically. So some machines will have turnaround happen at a low temperature at 36 seconds. Some machines will have turnaround happen at a higher temperature at 2.5 minutes. And most of that is probe driven. So if you switch probes out in your machine, you'll get a different turning point. So I wouldn't get too hung up on that, especially if you're looking from one machine to another machine. When you're looking for your own consistency's sake, I would look at the turnaround point, and this, I'm only bringing this up because it comes up in one of them. So a higher turnaround point could be problematic, or it could be a sign that something different happened between batch protocol. And so you want to look at your turning point always in connection to your max rate of rise. So if you have a too high of a turning point, but too low of a max rate of rise, you did something in your between batch protocol that tricked your thermocouple into having a higher turning point. But if it's a high turning point and a low max ROR, it's likely that the beans are taking the same journey because the two kind of cancel out. And then, we talk about charge temperature, the temperature at which you're putting the beans in, and then drop temperature is the terminology for the temperature at which they are dropped into the cooling bin. If it's a drum roaster, not cooling in chamber. So, yep. That's it on terms.
Great. Yeah. And so let's just switch over. And so, we'll get started kind of just chatting about all of the curves this week. And so just starting out, once again, these are all of the 5 curves against the baseline, and then you'll see the cupping form on the bottom there. We'll get started with the first curve. And so a little drum roll for this first curve. This one was coffee B. And with this curve, as I'm sure many of you noticed, there's some wobbling going on. And that was purposeful. It's the idea behind this curve was kind of creating a wobbly rate of rise, and then also a longer yellowing phase, or maillard reaction phase. And so we will throw that the cupping form notes on the top there. And then, this is a really interesting curve, Rob, because of the things that you were talking about. So if you can kind of just speak to these wobbles and what's going on with this one.
Yeah, so there's a lot of kind of crazy cool stuff going on. Let me bring my annotation bar up here because I feel like that might be useful.
And let me know if you want me to go back to the slide that shows the phases at the bottom as well, if you start to refer to any of them.
Yeah, for sure. I may not actually be able to annotate in this particular screen that I'm in. Let me double check.
No.
Oh, there we go. Annotate. All right, so there's a couple things worth looking at, and I'm going to start kind of at this right-hand side and work backwards, just to kind of identify, because when we talk about roasting, especially when we're hitting metrics and stuff like that, the most important thing is actually the less romantic thing, and it's color, right? So end color, both whole bean and ground, is going to be a bigger driver of flavor than most people in the specialty coffee industry realize. And so, all of the curve and stuff matters, especially if you're hitting the same whole bean and ground color. If you're not hitting the same whole bean and ground color, then your point of departure is already incredibly large, right? So we'll start first by kind of talking about that relationship here. And one of the things worth noting is on the chart that you were given, you have an in temperature for the baseline of 400 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take. It's 400.31, which is about 204 degrees 0.6 centigrade for those tuning in from basically every other country in the world where nobody uses Fahrenheit. And then 404 for the end temperature on curve 1, which is about 206.6 degrees centigrade. So we're talking about 2 degrees centigrade up. Now, on roasting machines, there's something interesting that happens, which is that the thin piece of metal that we've shoved into the swirling batch of organic material doesn't necessarily tell us the temperature of the swirling batch of organic material, right? And so what we notice here in this curve is that our rate of rise is significantly higher than the baseline. There it is. Hopefully it shows up on everybody's, disappeared. There it's back. Oh, I accidentally circled it twice. It's just a little lag. It's cool, don't worry about it. Aim ahead, right? And so with this rate of rise being higher than the baseline rate of rise by a significant margin, my first question when I saw this curve was, okay, well, was it higher heat application at the end of the roast? Mm-hmm. And if you have higher heat application at the end of the roast, the air temperature going through the roasting chamber is going to be hotter, and that will cause the bean temperature probe to swing hotter, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the beans are following suit, okay? Mm. And so there have been instances on multiple different brands of machines that have done this where I've gotten up to a 7 degrees centigrade temperature difference with the same color just because I'm driving the roast slightly differently at the end.
Interesting.
Okay? So my first reaction when I saw that we were about 2 degrees centigrade hotter at our end temp was to assume that 2 degrees centigrade was potentially just meaningless and it was a probe error and it was because we were driving with more heat at the end. So when you're actually evaluating your own curves, what you have to be sure you're doing if you have access to a color meter is checking that whole bean and ground color frequently, because it is really, really important, and because the thermocouple will tell you the truth as long as you're roasting the same way. As soon as you start roasting a different way, it stops telling you the same sort of data, right? And so if you've got a roaster that's just kind of like, oh shit, I'm a little slow, and then pumps up the gas a little bit, it could cause a rather large difference in how the thermocouple reads. So that would be one point to kind of look at.
Yeah.
And here you can see that we actually do have, and I'll circle it so it's a little bit more obvious, we do actually have one more point of color whole bean. Yep. So this coffee did, in fact, get a little bit darker. And so that slight greater darkness paired with the fact that it's about the same development time means that overall the whole bean and ground color is probably going to be just slightly darker, because development time tends to control, so the distance between beginning of first crack and end of the roast tends to control the color spread between your whole bean and ground color. So if you have the same general delta between your whole bean and ground, so we went from 2 minutes and 25 on the baseline to 2 minutes and 24 on this curve, 1 second's not going to cause any sort of significant difference likely. And so that means we have the same development time, which means our delta, or our difference in color between the whole bean and ground, should be the same. The whole bean color is a little bit darker, therefore the ground color is also a little bit darker. So a lot of the flavor difference that we're experiencing in this coffee is going to be due primarily to the fact that it's ever so slightly darker. Now, in addition to that, we do see a little bit longer in terms of the length of the Maillard reaction. Yep. And so the Maillard reaction goes from 3 minutes and 44 on the baseline curve to 4 minutes and 18. And I've got a cheat sheet. I'm just not like pulling stuff out of my brain. I wrote up a cheat sheet.
Rob has remembered all of the stats.
Let me look over to the side. Full recall. Okay. Total Recall. That's a different movie. And so with that longer time before first crack, what I would expect from this coffee just in general, and this is more than a 15-second swing. This is a 30-second swing. So you're starting to get into significant territory there. So I would say like, okay, this is probably going to taste a little bit more savory, a little bit heavier aftertaste potentially. And we see that reflected in the flavor notes with baked peach. We do get some of that creaminess kind of coming in, which only makes me think of drinking Bailey's out of a shoe. But so there you go. And then, some toast, because that little bit of extra roast character on the coffee. So yeah, so that would be kind of my evaluation on those, on curve number 1, I guess, to say.
Yep. And then kind of, I mean, it's not a factor that played into here, but this is something that, Rob, you had brought up previously when we first started chatting about kind of like ideas behind this competition. And then some of the reviewers brought up as well, is like these wobbles, you have to be very careful, especially differences between, when you're looking at differences between machines. And so I kind of wanted to just kind of dive into that a little bit and talk about those differences in curves and ROR readings amongst machines and probes. And yeah, just what's important and what's not important. So I'm going to pull this up, which was a previous research that you had done with Ann Cooper, a guest on our webinar last week. And if you could just kind of chat about this really quickly.
Yeah, for sure. So, there's certain assumptions in our industry that are not factual. That is that all temperature measurements are created equal and that all rate of rise calculations are created equal, right?
Yep.
So all of them are basically looking through, it's kind of like looking at something through rose-colored glasses or whatever colored glasses you particularly have. It's going to tinge everything else. And so the type of thermocouple you have and the amount of noise that thermocouple generates is going to be relevant, because the beans are likely taking a smoother trajectory. If you see your rate of rise going like up and down, there's not a physical way possible for the beans to actually be doing that. That is usually likely going to be due to electrical interference, some sort of grounding issue, having an overly sensitive probe, having the probe in the wrong place. You can get interference, like if you've got a variable frequency drive on your machine, those actually produce slight magnetic waves. And so if you're running your cable next to a VFD run electric cable, you're going to actually be creating your own magnetic interference. So first of all, big wobbles or any sort of noise that's induced in the system isn't going to be reflective of what the beans are actually doing. So that would be one thing. The second thing is it depends on how much air you're reading. So as long as your airflow is above your temperature, so I'll do it this way. So I'm trying to think, because I'm reversed in your screen. So I'm going to try and do it properly. So here we go, right? So if you're holding a high air temperature, the beans are always going to be rising to meet that air temperature. If your air temperature wobbles a little bit, it's still higher than the bean temperature, so you still have positive heat energy transfer. But if your thermocouple is picking up a little bit more of the air temperature than it is the bean temperature, you might see those wobbles look exaggerated, where the coffee is roasting along and gaining energy. So what I usually recommend for people is, like, if you see a rate of rise that freaks you out, cup it in a blind triangulation first, because just because it doesn't look, we'll make the joke Instagrammable, right, where people post profiles and they have to look a certain way, or you just get kind of dragged by all the commenters on, Facebook groups or whatever you're posting them in, which is a big mistake and waste of your time.
Don't do that.
It's just bad for your soul, really. But
yeah, you don't want that.
If you see that wobble and it concerns you, if you can't taste the difference in a blind triangulation, like say you set up 3 triangles and you can't taste it, then it's likely fine. And I say that not to give you an out. Like, the goal is for you to try to have a really well-controlled roast. But if you can't have a really well-controlled roast, you should always cup it and make sure that it actually tastes off and it's not just a temperature measurement issue. Okay, so that would be the first thing. Here you can see we've got 3 different, what looks like 3 very different roasts. And it's because they were 3 roasts that were done on 3 very different machines. The red line being off of a Loring. The blue line is Diedrich, I believe.
The blue is,
because my annotation's covering. Oh, Probat. Okay. Oh, this is from a different one we did. Okay.
Loring, and then
you've got the Gießen.
Correct, is the yellowish orange.
I was thinking it was from our original experiment, which looks even crazier because it was the UG15 Probat, and the probe was just in a really odd spot for that one. Oh, there, I can move my annotation bar. That actually helps a lot. So 3 different types of thermocouples in 3 different placements. And so the Loring 2 is running a kind of a crazy, it's a fully automated curve. And so if you actually saw the control, it would be like it's just automatically doing its stuff. It doesn't actually look that crazy, but you get the general idea. So what we're doing in this instance is we're lining up the events at which temperature changes happen or color changes or physical changes happen, so that they're hitting first crack at the same time.
Yep.
They're hitting yellowing at the same time. I missed that entirely. Circle instead. And then they're ending at the same time, and they have the same whole bean and ground color, the same weight loss percentage, and all that sort of thing. And we've done over 1,900 triangulations, and the pass rate is at just below 30% of the time people are actually able to pick out the difference between these three machines, despite the fact that they look wildly different.
Yep.
I was kind of hoping it was our first time that Ann and I did this, not the second or third one. Just because on that one, when we did it with a Diedrich, and we had a really fun time trying to get that one to do what we wanted.
Really?
And so,
Okay.
because the pilot light was tuned in too big on it, and we didn't want to change the settings because we were borrowing time on the machine. And so we actually had to on off the pilot light from about round one.
It looked like this. It was very similar.
Very ocean wave, yeah.
Yeah.
It was pretty rad. So, but the idea just basically being like, all of the flavors that we're looking for in coffee are happening not because of some sort of magical contact with some sort of machine, metal, or system, or even to a certain extent airflow. They're happening because the beans have X amount of heat over X amount of time. And they're hitting these chemical reactions within the same time. The chemical reactions are allowed to happen in the same way. Yep. And at the end, you've got the same color. And because of that, the coffees taste the same, to the point where professional cuppers can only taste the difference around 30% of the time, which is around random chance, to be perfectly honest. I'm seeing random questions pop up. Yeah, smoke evacuation, you do want to make sure you're getting smoke out of the drum. So if we had an old Probat, we'd put it on the aroma lock setting on the wheel. That would probably change things up a bit for us. So as long as you're doing basic things, like you've got enough airflow movement to take chaff and smoke out of the machine, then you're in a pretty good way. But the general idea is, as long as you're hitting these general goals properly, and you're doing so in a way that's not absolutely driving crazy, you're probably going to get the same result. So taking that back then to the curve that we did on step number 1 here, you will see that there is. There you go. Come on back.
Do you want just the curve?
Yeah, that works. Perfect.
Oh.
Sweet. And so you'll see, like, is there wobble? Yes, there's definitely some wobble in this. You could chalk this up to, for example, this would look very similar to if you had a small batch size in your roaster, and you're a little bit unsure of how to drive with that small batch.
Yeah.
And so you get these little wobbles where you're like, whoop, nope, that was a little bit too much. Nope, a little bit too much power there. But generally speaking, they're hitting the same sort of categories. And, in this instance, it wouldn't have been a complete match because of the difference in color. But, that's kind of what I would chalk some of this up to, is more airflow interference.
Yeah, you see this type of curve a lot at the world competitions. So when they're roasting like the Gießens, if you look at the curves that we have on our website, the winning curves have a tendency to look like this. Really? People go, what the heck? What's going on? And yeah, it's that air temp often is what's being read in mixed with the beans.
Yeah, and that's why it's important to talk to people like manufacturers or machinists in your area about where to locate the thermocouple if you don't like where yours is currently reading.
Yep.
There's some great resources for people that have opinions about that.
Yeah. Awesome. So there was a question from Rudy in Tijuana, San Diego. Would Curve 1 potentially have spicy or roasty notes?
So this one, I think that because the color differential isn't massive and the temperature difference isn't massive, I think that roasty characteristic is showing up as toast in terms of the notation. Mm-hmm. That would be my takeaway from it.
Yeah. And I agree with you, Rob, there.
And then 2 questions about rate of rise. One was just addressing rate of rise drop at first crack. Like, how would you interpret that? Should you freak out? And then somebody else asked if the rate of rise bumps back up at 3 instead of gently going downwards. can that be a probe issue? Like, for example, if the gas isn't increased.
Oh, so if it just kind of comes back up on its own accord.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's a couple different things with the rate of rise, like the craziness that happens there. Most of that is going to be water vapor content that's being released.
Yep.
The big question I have that I don't know the answer to is, we know how the water vapor content being released around first crack affects the probe because we see that. The thing that we have difficulty with is, how is this actually affecting the beans, because our temperature measurement of the beans is not perfect, as we've described before. We're got this thin piece of metal that's got a lot of airflow. So I would say that it depends on your machine type. Now, where Scott and I have talked about this and where we agree, because I don't know if you all know, Scott and I are pretty friendly, and we had a chance to chat about roasting. It's like, I generally try to tell people, like, if you're trying to do a production roast and you want it to be easy to match, the constant declining is probably going to be your best bet, because you don't have anything weird that you have to try and reproduce. Now, that being said, I'm a little bit more wiggly and laissez-faire in some senses than I would say he probably is on the matter. And it depends on your roasting machine. The thinner the thermocouple, the bigger the drop down and flick back can be, because of water vapor and how that's affecting things. I have a slide for that, but it would be probably hard I'll present it later at the end, I guess, when we're done, so we don't have to swap presentations back and forth. But basically, if you run the same one roast with 3 different thermocouples in it, there are times where you can see some weirdness happening on a really thin thermocouple, and the 3 millimeter and 6 millimeter probes don't see anything at all. And so I think that, for people like on the Lorings, which are using 1.5 mil thermocouples, and I'm not sure if anybody else is using quite that thin yet, but you all can correct me if I'm wrong. So if you're on like a 1.5 mil thermocouple or sub 2 millimeter thermocouple, then, if you see it, it's probably just that it's really, really sensitive, and I'm less likely to believe that the beans are doing it. If you see a dramatic decline on a 6 mil probe, something weird is going on, and you should be probably a little bit more in tune to what's happening and maybe control that a little bit better. So part of it is reading, I would say, and then, if it comes back up on you, once again, that is partially dependent on thermocouple. And it depends on how you're roasting too. Like for me, when I'm roasting darker, I expect to see it come back up, because that's just how it is for me when I roast darker. If I'm roasting lighter, maybe I don't expect that. So,
yeah, great.
Cool.
So we're just jumping back. So once again, that first roast curve, the correct coffee was coffee B, as we chatted, and then we'll move on to curve 2. So
Sweet.
curve 2, this one actually is pretty straightforward. Really, this is just a much shorter development time ratio at the end, and the correct answer, the coffee that matches with this curve, would be coffee C. And so I will pull up the notes, and then Rob, if you just want to chat kind of the influence of that shorter development time.
Yeah, they were really nice to everybody on this one. I don't know what the deal was. Too nice, I would say. So with this, I don't say that to be a jerk. So if somebody got it wrong.
Oh no, yeah.
I don't mean it that way, but
as I'm sitting here in shame, having that one wrong. So
I would never pass up an opportunity to shame Devin, but that's fine. So anyway, this is not only a lower in temperature, but it's also a shorter development time and a lighter whole bean color.
Yep.
So all of those comboed up, as we discussed in the last slide. So shorter development time means the difference between our whole bean and ground color is bigger. And so if our whole bean color is slightly lighter, then the ground color is significantly lighter.
Yep.
That's paired with a lower end temperature. And so we're getting into this kind of under roasted sort of category with this coffee. Not necessarily underdeveloped, because 2 minutes dev time, or right about 2 minutes development time, because we're at 1:51, is still really reasonable. That's a totally fine development time, depending on your water and the style of roasting that you do. So it's not necessarily underdeveloped. The issue is that it's a little bit under roasted. And so that's where we start to see this vegetal characteristic come in with the snap pea. The tomato goes from like a sweet tomato jam to just a straight up Roma tomato, and you get that sort of Kenyan bisque sort of characteristic.
Yep.
If you've ever had a really, really herby, tomatoey Kenyan that's just a little bit under, and it tastes more like soup than what you want. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Great. Yeah. And
But
so.
yeah, otherwise everything else is pretty straightforward on this one.
Yep. So yeah, roast curve 2, that matches with coffee C. And then moving on to curve 3, which is a really interesting curve. Curve 3, that matches with coffee A. And the idea behind this one was creating a long development time ratio and a much shorter yellowing period, which is pretty funky. And so Rob will dive into that one.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting here too. So if you don't mind showing the slide with all of them on it, so we can highlight how curve 3 looks in relation to all of the other ones.
The developments?
Which color it is. So go back to, sorry.
I think that slide.
You were just there, right there. Yep.
This one.
Well,
no, not this one.
No, it was that one right there. Stop.
Yeah.
Pause. There you go.
Sorry, you're a little behind. Sorry.
You're lagging. No worries. Okay.
Okay. Cool. So I'm going to draw an arrow here to the turning point for the green one, which is number 3. You can see we've got a higher turning point, and then it kind of lags below here and then shoots on up. All right. So we've got a higher turning point than our baseline. I think that's our baseline at the very bottom there. Is the baseline the lowest curve? I'm having a.
It is not. It's actually hidden in there.
Okay, so it's in the mix. Gotcha.
Yeah.
So we've got a on point and then a low rate of rise. So that would mean, kind of starting from scratch. So now we can go all the way back to where we were. Sorry.
Perfect.
So with that low, or with that normal turning point and then the low max rate of rise, that means that we were just came in underpowered, right? We didn't hit our target in terms of where we wanted to turn. And so then there's this heavy push on the part of the burner to try and catch back up, which is kind of what we see reflected here in basically a large plateau. Someone's just driving the burner at it and has the power to do it, which is, great. They do end up getting to color change late, and then they continue to accelerate and end up getting to first crack early because they haven't really controlled their burner quite appropriately. So we've gotten to first crack a little early, which means expectations change to being maybe a little bit lighter in aftertaste and a little bit potentially more floral. However, we then go into a development time that is almost 30 seconds longer in development time. And so we are lengthening here. Draw that in. So by lengthening development time, we are causing the delta between the whole bean and ground to become smaller. We end up with matching color, which means the interior, matching whole bean color, sorry, which means the interior color is darker. So we actually have, as a result, a darker ground coffee color. We have a longer development time, which means some of those volatile acids that we might want are starting to disappear a little bit. Which is why you see a negative on acidity. You've got a negative on sweetness because there's a greater degree of caramelization. Sometimes when we talk about caramel, especially in the US, we just think sweet, where caramel is actually a very bitter compound. And so more caramelization, more sugar browning tends to create an experience of more bitterness and not more sweetness. Depending, if you're really sensitive to acidity and do not like it, then more caramelization usually means lower acidity, which is why some people, I think, find it less astringent and would potentially call it more sweet. But generally speaking, less sucrose because we have more caramelization. Not that there's much sucrose to begin with in roasted coffee. And because of the faster time reaching first crack, that's why we've got a list of negative body as well. So flavor notes, you've got the peach, you got the tomato-like, you got the grapefruit, but then we start getting into dark chocolate and some spice. And all of this hitting the same in temperature because, in temperature and color are somewhat intertwined.
Yeah, no, I think you explained it perfectly. And then, yeah, just like that movement from that chocolate to dark chocolate just has to do from the baseline to this coffee A. It's just that development of those sugars, like pushing them a little farther at that during that development stage. So yeah, and you touched on it. So.
And this is a roast we've all done, right? Where you charge and you're like, that wasn't
you're
hot
rolling.
enough. I need to push. Yeah.
Yep. And then you start moving a little too fast, and you're like, I need to back it off, and then things happen. So, cool. And so once again, that was roast curve 3, and that matches with coffee A. So we'll dive into the final 2 curves, starting with curve 4. Curve 4, the correct answer was coffee E. And for this one, we had a slightly higher start temperature, and then also a shorter time overall here. But the phases, the percentages within the phase are pretty similar, though since it's a shorter time, all those are kind of shorter than from the baseline. So you kind of have this like squished curve with a little bit higher of a start temperature and a higher turning point. So if Rob, you wanted to chat a little bit about this one.
Absolutely. So what we got going on here, and this is kind of where we talked about sometimes things will cancel out. So we've got a higher turning point because of the higher charge, but then it looks like whoever was driving this roast, if it was a real roast, then used a lower heat application because we've got a lower max rate of rise compared to our reference. So we've got a higher turn and a lower max rate of rise, which means they were trying to kind of get the ship somewhat back on course. But they never did a big enough adjustment. So we probably would have wanted to see the max rate of rise come down here to get that to work out.
Yep.
So, color change, we get to it just a little bit early by about less than 20 seconds. So, and this is the thing, there's, I don't want to say diminishing returns, but within a certain range of time, it's very difficult to taste differences. Mm-hmm. And so, plus or minus 10 seconds, I'm generally not worried about. Plus or minus 20, we might be in a range where somebody might start to notice a difference. And so like when we've done the Can You Taste the Roasting System stuff with Ann, when we're matching profiles across machines, we're aiming for plus or minus 10. So there's going to be some variation here potentially, but it's still probably not going to be noticeable from a customer standpoint. Like the customer's not going to be like, you got to yellow faster. Probably not going to happen, just being realistic. Getting to first crack a little bit faster is probably going to accentuate that floral character in the coffee. So 8 minutes isn't necessarily going to be too fast to get to first crack. No. There's a Kenyan coffee that we have at our facility right now that I think we're hitting 7.5 minutes for our first crack, and we're doing about 1.5 minute dev time off that. So we've got like a 9-minute roast overall. But in this instance, with this coffee, we're just, this is faster than our goal. This is faster than our baseline. So there's going to be changes based on that. And it shows up in the taste notes as, oolong tea, floral, that sort of thing. Really high citrus. Our development time is pretty dang close to the same. It's about 9 seconds shorter, which is not going to be really significant unless you're teetering on the edge of underdeveloped anyway. Which it doesn't look like we are. We still have that nice citrus, although there is some astringency marked on there, which could be related to just overly high acid for this coffee. So maybe that 9 seconds made a difference. Color's right on the money. In temperature is pretty much right on the money. Just it's a very small decimal point higher. But same color, same development time, basically same in temperature. Relatively similar development time, just a little bit more bright and acidic off of that.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Awesome. And so then moving forward from here, I had some of your notes here, but you touched you touched on all of this.
Hey, good. I remembered.
Rob is consistent, folks. So just one more time, roast curve 4 is coffee E, which brings us then to curve 5, which then the only answer left is curve D. And so curve 5 was kind of, in some ways, a little bit opposite of curve 4, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the results are opposite, just because there's things that are happening during the roast that aren't going to create opposites. And so you have a lower starting temperature for this curve, which then you have a lower turning point. And then in the end, you kind of have a little bit of a longer time and a slightly lower end temperature. And so if you kind of want to dive into this one, Rob, it'd be awesome.
Oh yeah, and you saying that reminded me of one thing that I failed to touch on in the last one.
Oh, cool. Do you want me to go back to it, or do you want to just talk about it?
No, it's just like a super quick thing. So
cool, totally.
With higher charge temperatures, there is a potential of introducing some roasting defect, tipping, or sorry, not tipping per se, but scorching, which will disappear at the end of the roast, so you won't be able to see it visually. So you have to either notice it in the sight glass or notice it when you're pulling the trier, early stages of roast pre-browning. Because if you charge too hot and the metal on your machine's too hot, it's going to cause little burnt spots to appear on the outside of the seed, which will cause the coffee to taste normal, but with a burnt character kind of lingering in the background, which you could also describe as that spiciness. As you described a higher charge temp. So there's a significantly higher charge temp as opposed to this one, which has a significantly lower charge temp. So maybe that astringency came from that characteristic as well. So please note that you do have to pull your trier early to check, especially if you're doing something like that you're not accustomed to doing on that coffee or that machine, just to make sure you're not causing scorching. Once you're comfortable with the coffee, maybe you don't have to, but it's a good idea to make sure that you're not scorching by overheating the metal and charging too hot. If you notice scorching where you formerly did not have scorching, it might mean that your ventilation is plugged up. And so it's causing low airflow, which is causing the drum metal to absorb more heat because there's less airflow moving across it. So yeah, keep an eye on stuff, folks. Clean your stuff, right?
Clean your machine, people.
It's COVID times. Wash your hands, but also please clean your machine so you don't have a fire. Yeah. All right, curve number 5. So this one has higher body, higher acidity, higher sweetness, and is lower in color. And you'll notice that the development time isn't particularly that far off. I mean, we're going from 25 to 32, so we're a 7-second difference, nothing major. You will see that we are, pretty much right in line there. And the only other one that went that slow was that went lighter was curve 2, which was vegetal. And this one isn't quite vegetal. Which is why we have some of the notes kind of changing the way that they do. So we have a lighter color, we have a lighter end temperature, but it's not that light. We have slightly longer development time. So what we probably are seeing is that we've got a little bit lighter whole bean color, but we've got a little bit darker ground color, just slightly. And that's kind of what's keeping everything in balance. We do get to first crack a little bit later. So we do have a little bit more time pre-first crack. We're probably seeing a little bit heavier aftertaste coming from that. Maybe a little bit more savoriness, which is why this, peach shows up in a really huge way, and that creaminess once again shows up. So that longer time to first crack is denoted by that. Maybe some of these caramel notes have something to do with that as well. Botanical, so we do have some florals happening. We still have some grapefruit happening, but the real ones to me that are kind of showing up are this creamy characteristic as well as having some spice. Having some, the citrus is really represented as this peach and this grapefruit, which are more defined and less kind of ethereal. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Cool. And I will really quickly just clear those. Cool. And so, just to round this out, that was curve 5, and that matches with curve D, which kind of rounds out all 5 curves. And before we really jump into kind of any more questions and answers, Rob, you said you had those slides about the 3 thermocouples.
Yes. We could definitely go grab those real quick.
Yeah, I think that was super cool. So I think you may have already shared that with Taylor and I previously. And I think really cool
I think I did.
For folks I think that'd be really cool for folks to see.
Pardon me while I make my I'm concentrating face here as I try.
Oh, you're fine. Yeah. And so I'll just speak to everybody who's watching. So as Rob is dialing up that photo, if you have any questions about these curves, once again, as Taylor and I had mentioned last week, feel free to ask a question here. But if we don't get to that question, feel free to email either of us. My email is eric@balzacbrothers.com, BALZAC brothers.com. And Taylor's is taylor@cropster.com. So we have Rob's screen up now, I think.
Yeah, forgive me, I stole your screen.
You sure did. That's a lot of power.
Yeah. You should have never made me a
should have never made you a co-host.
All right. So anyway, yeah, this is one roast on one machine, and the blue line represents a 1.5 millimeter thermocouple. And these are the same manufacturer of thermocouples, same materials, same type, and same placement. They're all within a space about yay big without actually touching each other. So we've got the 1.5 mil thermocouple. We've got the yellow, which represents the 3 millimeter thermocouple, and the red, which represents a 6 millimeter probe. And you can see because of this, and this is why a lot of times we as consultants have a hard time saying like, well, here's what I would say your max rate of rise should be, or here's what your minimum rate of rise should be.
That was a question.
Or what your temperature is. Oh, was it? Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay. Sweet. Well, that works great. Is because it's very probe dependent, right?
Yeah.
And depending on placement. So these are located in the drop door of a roaster as well. So if they were up in the drum or in the faceplate, it would be a little bit different reading as well. But you'll notice here, like the really thin thermocouple peaks out at a higher max rate of rise, turns around at a significantly lower temperature. And this is in Fahrenheit, so I apologize to those who are in centigrade. So, but then it rebounds and becomes the highest temperature. So the thinner the thermocouple, typically the larger the scale, the thicker the thermocouple, the more compressed the scale, okay? And you'll see that too with the rate of rise. So here you can see, this is right where we hit first crack, right where my mouse is now. And you can see here the thinner thermocouple drops really significantly and then kind of bounces just a little bit. Oh, wow, it's giving me an opportunity to admit people. Should I admit people?
I will take care of that. No worries.
Okay, you'll take care of that. Yeah, it's giving me all sorts of options. So you'll see that drop off and then kind of rebound just a little bit, whereas the 6 mil and the 3 mil probe, and 3 mil is probably the most common, so the yellow line is probably the most common type of thermocouple that's used, at least in terms of diameter. You can see those don't register it at all, right? So I feel like that's a significant thing. And with that, I'm going to give up screen share, so I give up all these admin powers and can go back to the screen. So Eric, if you want to throw your screen back up.
You betcha. Let's do.
Just so they got something to look
so
at.
Something
there.
to look at other than just our faces, which could be a thing. Yeah. So that's all 5 curves there, and we are kind of coming up on the hour, so we probably have time for a few questions here.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's answer some questions. Devin, have you?
Yeah, there was a quick one.
Do you have any fun ones? Yeah.
Yeah, well, there was a quick one for roast curve 5.
Sure.
It was basically just asking why it has higher acidity.
Yep. So we'll go back to that one.
Why does roast curve 5 have higher acidity? The lighter color.
Yeah.
Yeah. So color does impact that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And that's where it definitely can get tricky. So you see maybe like a longer roast, and you see like, okay, maybe that should maybe then have a lower acidity, but yeah, this lighter color in this one is definitely playing a part.
Yep.
Cool.
100%.
2 ones that I think you can answer pretty quickly. One was, how would you manage to have so much control with a Kenyan coffee after first crack? Like, I know that's a general problem, but maybe you can talk a little bit to Kenyans.
These are computer generated. I'm just kidding. Kenyans can be really tricky. And so it depends on which style of roasting. So it's a lot easier to have a constantly declining rate of rise if you roast faster. And so if you have a higher peak rate of rise and you're coming down kind of like already coming down at that general angle, it can be easier to maintain that angle all the way down to the end of the roast. So, but there are trade-offs to that. Like in coffee, it's very difficult to both have your cake and eat it as well. So I think that it is, it is difficult to control, and it is a lot of water vapor coming out. And I would say the biggest thing is make sure you're cupping it and finding the flavors that you want. And as long as you're finding the flavors that you want, depending on where your probe is set, it might just be bad probe placement or wrong, thickness or something along those lines. And then just kind of chalk it up to like, well, this is how it's going to be, and not worry too much about it. But if you want to get that like really, really, great constant declining sort of thing and have control over what's happening there, you just have to come in with a lot more energy by roasting faster in general, and then allowing that to just kind of continue the fall down. So it looks gradual because it's the fall that it's been doing the whole time. If that makes sense. My friend Michael De Renard in Copenhagen, who's a wonderful friend as well as a amazing coffee consultant, sometimes says to me, the higher the mountain, the easier the fall, which I think is, referring to the max rate of rise. I think he's, might be onto something with that. But, that would be one way. The other way too is just kind of making sure you're coming in with enough power and leaving your burner on longer at a higher level than what you normally would, and then using a declining feature. Now, the problem being, if your probe is reading more water than it is beans, then you inadvertently might over roast your beans. So,
yep. Cool. Maybe one more question, Devin.
Sure.
Oh man, if we're just gonna do one.
Yeah, that's tough. I know.
I got more time.
All right, well then, start dialing them up then.
Sweet. There was an interesting one from Martin Trejo that says, is it possible to have a darker interior bean color than exterior?
I've only done it twice.
I would imagine if it was a light roast.
Oh, no.
No, okay.
So if it's a light roast, it's almost impossible.
Okay.
So now what they might be referring to, so if you cross-section a bean, if you cut it in half, it can look like the interior is slightly darker than the exterior. And that's because the coffee doesn't store sugars evenly throughout the seed. Like, we often think about coffee as being monolithic, unfortunately, where the reality is it's a lot more chaotic than that. Every seed, even from the same tree, is going to have a different amount of each chemical composition content. Right? It's all kind of mess, where it was on the branch, how much sunlight that particular part got, how ripe it got, how it went through processing, where it was at in the fermentation tank. There's a lot of variability in coffee, as much as we try to make it not variable. And that even extends to the seed. We think about the seed as being monolithic, but the reality is the coffee is going to store sugars in different places. And so on some coffee seeds, the seed might have more sugars on the outside. Some it might have more interior, and sugar is what causes browning. So when you cut a bean in half and cross-section it, sometimes you'll see these bands of sugar which look like bands of darkness. It doesn't mean that it's roasted more in the core than it does on the surface. Coffee can only roast from the outside in. There's no magical form of heat transfer that allows heat to penetrate the inside first and then roast outward, whether it be convection, conduction, or radiation. Like, radiation is how the sun heats the earth. The earth's core isn't hot because of the sun. It's hot because of all the immense pressure and everything else going on, right? So all of them heat the outside, which then go to the middle. So the whole bean and ground color, now if we're talking that, whole bean and ground color, the whole bean is almost always going to be darker than the ground by a margin. The only time that has not been the case is when I've been doing really, really dark roast Sumatrans for clients. And I mean like really dark roast and really long development times. There have been a couple instances where we've had darker ground colors than whole bean. And that's even at a very fine grind setting, which is remarkable. So that's my 2 cents on that. But that's a great question.
That is a great question.
No, very cool. Karina Fernandez asks, is it wise to add heat to a roast once rate of rise starts declining, especially if it isn't hitting the baseline curve?
Ooh, that is a good question. So I am not opposed to adding heat later on in the roast, especially depending on how things are set up. So if I'm doing a smaller batch size, my burner application looks more like a mountain or a plateau where I'm climbing up and then hitting it and then climbing back down. Part of the reason for that is because I'm going to be utilizing the amount of heat that's naturally stored inside the roaster to kind of hit my first part of the curve. So it's basically like having a really long soak at the beginning and then stepping up and then stepping back down toward the end. And so there are instances in which I'm not starting high burner and then going to low burner, kind of all the time. Now, if you notice yourself falling behind, I would say that you're better off adding burner. If it's like early stages in the roast, you could definitely add more burner. And I wouldn't worry as much about that, especially in the early stages. Like, the air temperature is already so much hotter than the coffee. The coffee is already roasting as fast as it potentially can. So you're not really going to change a lot that's going on, especially if we're talking pre-yellowing before chemical reactions have started. But even in the Maillard reaction, you might be able to add heat energy into the system and not be causing an issue. Now, once you get kind of at the end, it's going to potentially give you some squirreliness that you're not wanting. And so I would be very careful to add heat at the end of the roast. I would probably avoid doing it, just because if you add heat, especially post first crack, you have a higher chance of causing the thermocouple to skew up higher or down lower than what you would normally hit, which means it becomes a less beneficial predictor of end color. And so if you have like a higher burner at the end of the roast than normal, that's where you're going to see the temperature skew up, and you're going to potentially drop it too light. Yeah, because the beans won't have roasted yet. So that's a great question, though.
That is, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for asking it. So I think we should probably plug next week's event, and then if we want to continue with questions, we can.
Yeah, sure. Plug the next week, and then I'll give you another 5-10 minutes. What do you say?
Sweet. I think that sounds good.
Awesome. Perfect.
So thank you everyone for joining us for RoastID. This is a new event. This is our first time doing it. It started as an idea for SCA, and then now it became an online event that's global, and we've had more participants than we ever could have had at
in
SCA.
person.
So
yeah.
This is super cool. We have our last round next week. The competition opens on Wednesday. It closes again. It's a 24-hour window, and then we'll have it again with Joe Morocco closing it out with us. So that'll be super fun. You've probably watched him on YouTube videos. Worked at Cafe Import in Mill City, and then now I don't want to say the wrong company name.
I don't know how to say it properly, but I believe it's List and Beisler.
Well, this is embarrassing, but I love Joe. He's a super cool guy, incredibly knowledgeable. Come with questions ready. But yeah, we're looking forward. Well, also, Eric, will we announce who won during that?
Correct.
Afterwards?
Yeah, so we are going to announce actually the winners next week as well. We're posting a top 10 leaderboard, and so be sure to tune in next week for the round 3, especially if you've been competing in both rounds. But even if you haven't, if you got a good chunk right this week and get a good chunk next right week, you never know. And so and we'll have prizes for the top 10 people placing in the top 10. So tune in for that.
Very cool. Well, thank you, everyone. I see all the thanks from everyone. Thank you, Rob. We really appreciate it.
Yep.
My pleasure.
Now it's way harder for me to find the questions that people had. So give me just 1 second.
You just lost all those.
But then I get to see all the thank yous. So
that's true.
Yeah. And thanks everybody for coming, hanging out.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Especially everyone who competed, everyone who joined us during this webinar. Really appreciate it. It's awesome to see so many people.
Oh, okay. This one I think is interesting. So how would Rob approach this type of challenge himself? I tried looking at everything in balance and got the wrong answers. I just checked my earlier notes and found that looking at the curves without trying to match the coffee descriptions was spot on. So like if you were to break this down and say, next week, what should people kind of break it down as?
Ooh.
Yeah. I mean, for me, and this is just in terms of like matching coffees in general.
Yep.
I'm always going to look at the objective notes before I look at the subjective notes.
Mm.
So the first thing for me would be probably looking at color readings, and those in relation to in temperature and development time. And if there's rate of rise weirdness around that. So like, I would kind of look at those first. And then I would look at the markers in terms of body, acidity, sweetness, and those sorts of things. That would probably be where I'd spend the majority of my focus, looking at those in relation to the curves. And then I would also look at the flavor notes and then try to kind of understand that in relation to how all those other things are playing. So that'd be the direction that I would work at it. And for better or for worse, they followed a lot of the materials in my book about what maillard lengths do and all these things.
I was about to say, like,
for better or worse.
There's like kind of a book on this.
It might be worth if you've had the opportunity to read through that, just to assume that they're just assuming I'm correct, which is never the right choice. But they have to make some assumptions because this isn't a roast, right? So,
These are assumptions.
Yeah. So, that's kind of how I would look through things.
But
that's a good question.
Cool. One last one, and it was asked a few times throughout the webinar. Altitude while roasting, what impact does that have?
It's It's a big one. Usually with altitude, you end up not getting as much air density, and you get a little bit more difficulty transmitting heat via convection, which is the primary means of heat transfer. And so a lot of the people that I've met that roast at altitude, or any of the times I've roasted at altitude for clients, it tends to be a little bit of a struggle to push the heat energy into the coffee in the same way. Now, the events like yellowing and first crack and all that, because we're heating the coffee so quickly, it kind of creates its own interior atmosphere. Like it's under, 11, 12 atmospheres of pressure interior. So the fact that you're at a couple thousand feet probably isn't that big of a deal to the coffee seed. So I don't expect massive changes in terms of when these events may happen. But what I would expect to be different is the amount of heat energy you have to throw at the coffee to get it to do that. And so I would expect probably just having to lower batch size, run more burner than normal, be cognizant of your airflow, make sure you're not running too much airflow, because the faster the airflow, the harder a time you're going to have heating it. And so if you're running a really, really high airspeed on your fan, as well as being at altitude, it's just going to be a real struggle to push heat into that coffee. So you may want to think about having it toned down just a little bit, at least in the beginning of the roast. And then if you want to open your airflow up toward the end to get better control, that's definitely a possibility. So that would be my expectations.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rob. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, everybody who came.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
I think this was an awesome webinar. I look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Yeah. Good to see a lot of friends on here too that I otherwise would not have gotten a chance to see. So.
Yeah, it's like being at SEA. Like I feel happier having done this. It's like something I needed.
It's like being at SEA, but without all the bad convention center food. We're like, I just paid $20 for a pizza, and it's really disappointing.
Also without the hangovers. So that's, at least for me.
I'm getting too old for that stuff.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
all right.
everyone.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
See you.
Bye.